Hello and welcome to the next episode of my channel where I'll be taking up the lesson Poets and Pancakes written by Ashoka Mitran. Now this lesson is in class 12 Flamingo book. In this chapter Poets and Pancakes, the author talks about the Gemini studio which is situated in the present day Chennai. It was owned by Mr. S.S. Vasan, and he had around 600 people working for him. This Gemini studio basically made movies for Tamil Nadu and other South Indian states. Now, Pancake was the name of the cosmetic brand which was used by this studio, and often it could be seen trucks and trucks loaded with this makeup brand reaching the Gemini studio. Now, it is believed that the Gemini studio was being used or which was using Robert Clive's old stable. It was believed that Robert Clive's old stable was being used as a Gemini studio, and it is also mentioned that a very small but important part of Robert Clive's life was spent in erstwhile Madras by him. Now, the story starts with the mention of the makeup department and the story department. According to the writer, Gemini Studio was a perfect example of national integration because people from various states had worked in it. Whether a Bengali or somebody from Karnataka or Andhra was always found sometime working in the story department of the Gemini Studio. Next, the author talks about the makeup department, and here the office boy, who was not actually a boy, he was a man of 40 years. A makeup boy's job was to slap makeup on the faces of a crowd. So whenever a crowd needed makeup, it was the job of the office boy to slap makeup on their faces, and not a single pore was to be left without makeup. Here, a very interesting point has been mentioned by the author, and that is makeup was done on the basis of hierarchy. The main actor was to be was made to look the ugliest, the second main a little less ugly, and the one who had normal roles were just ugly. Now you will be surprised. Makeup is done to make people look beautiful, but here makeup was done to make them look ugly. This is because in those days the makeup was done indoors with limited lights. So in order to make them look presentable on screen, they were made to look ugly. Now, the office boy, as I've already said, was actually a grown-up man in the makeup department. Though his job was quite an easy one, the office boy considered himself unworthy of the job, and he felt that something great was meant for him. And he felt that he could have been an actor, a screenwriter, anything possible. And often he was frustrated with his job. The narrator had a very simple job according to the other people working in the Gemini studio. His job was to cut newspaper articles, and he used to sit in a small cubicle. So anybody who passed by and saw him cutting the newspaper would often give him a lecture regarding work. But the narrator often dreaded, he was scared of one man. And who was that? The office boy. Because office boy would often enter his room and then pour out his frustration on the narrator. Frustration regarding not doing well in his job, and that the entire frustration was pointed at only one person, and that was Kothumulangan Subbu, who was number 2 at the Gemini studio. So the office boy was frustrated with himself, and according to him, the reason of his frustration was Kothumulangan Subbu. Subbu was also not so much educated, or he was not too great than the office boy, but according to the office boy, he had been very lucky because he was a Brahmin. And Kothumulangam Subbu was a genius. Whenever the producer or the director faced any problem in shooting a particular scene, he would come up with 14 different alternatives. He was a literary genius. He could write poems, incredible poems, and the narrator feels that he was capable of writing even more complex poems. He could write good stories, but the most important thing was he was a charitable man. He used to feed everybody who used to come to his home. He used to feed everyone. But still, Kothumulangan Subbu had enemies. This is because he was very close to the boss, Mr. Vasan, and people felt that he was a sycophant. A little recap. Till now we have talked about three people working in the Gemini studio. First is the office boy, who is not actually an office boy. He was a man of 40 years, and his job was to slap makeup on the crowd, on the face of the crowd. And the second is the narrator, whose work was to cut newspaper clippings sitting in the cubicle. And he was really frustrated because everybody used to come in and make him feel that he was doing no work. But he was most frustrated because of the office boy, because he used to enter and give him long epics lectures on how he was frustrated with his job. And the narrator secretly wished that the office boy was never free. Always there was a crowd for him to do makeup on. Then we spoke about Kothumulangan Subbu, who was number 2 at the Gemini studio. Even though he was always found roaming around with the producer and the boss of the studio, his name in the attendance roll was in the story department. Next, we'll talk about the legal advisor who worked in the story department, and he was a lawyer and he provided legal advice to the writer. Once a shooting was under progress, the heroine, a highly emotional girl, got angry with the director and producer. While the whole set stood stunned at this, the legal advisor recorded her voice. She was angry. So in frustration, she was just telling anything, whatever was coming in her mind, to the director and producer. But the legal advisor secretly recorded whatever she was saying without her permission and made her listen to it, thus resulting in the end of her career. This incident gave him the title of illegal advisor. Now, everybody in the studio was a Gandhiite, Khadiite. They used to wear khadi. But the legal advisor was the only one who was often found in trousers, shirt, and tie. He was the odd man out. Next, we will talk about communism. Communism was a new political order that was spreading throughout the world in those days, especially Asian countries. Communism preached equality of people, abolition of poverty and class division, while it discouraged private ownership. But communism was winning a negative impression due to capitalist countries like America. So this communism thought was spreading everywhere, and people in the Gemini studio were also talking about it. In those days, MRA, that is the Moral Rearmament Army, was an international team of actors and actresses that was spreading anti-communist feelings throughout the world. Once again, in those days, people were talking about communism everywhere, and especially in Gemini studio. So to counter communism all over the world, there was a group of actors called the Moral Rearmament Army, and they were going around preaching anti-communism. The MRA came to Chennai and saw how influential Gemini Studio was, because around 600 people worked in Gemini Studio. So the team got permission from Mr. Vasan, that is the boss, to stage their plays at Gemini Studio. Vasan was only happy to give them permission because he hoped that his staff would get inspiration from the international team, how they were acting and how they were doing makeup and what kind of stage and props they were using. But little did Vasan know of their intention. MRA staged their plays with hidden anti-communist messages and went away, and it was yet after some time that Vasan realized he had been fooled. It was not just a play. It was a play with a hidden meaning. What was the hidden meaning? Anti-communism. Anti-communism means group which is against private ownership. And Vasan was privately owning the Gemini studio. Next incident the narrator talks about is the invitation to a poet who was not known by anyone at Gemini studio. This poet's name was Stephen Spender. He was once a prominent communist editor and a poet from England. He came to studio, he gave his speech, and his lecture was about communism on one side and about his struggle, how he became a poet on the other. Whatever he spoke was great and everything, but his accent was so different, was such terrible that none of the Gemini staff could clearly understand. And then they didn't understand what Spender is actually talking, and they didn't even know who he was. Initially, they thought he's just an editor, and that's why he was given a good reception. You know, people generally try to impress the media people so that they can get a good publicity. So people in the studio felt that he was an editor. Later on, they came to know that he was actually a poet. But when he spoke, they didn't understand what he was speaking, and they didn't even understand why he was called or invited at the studio. They fell into shame for not being able to understand the poet and wished not to meet him again. Now, the chapter ends with two incidents, one in which the author sees the name of Spender again in a magazine. And when he sees his name in the magazine, he feels very happy. It feels as if he has met his long lost brother. The name of the magazine was Encounter, and the author was going through this magazine regarding a prose writing competition. And the second time, when the author had lost his job and he was looking for some cheap book to read, he found a book called The God That Failed, which had essays written by 8 prominent authors, and one of them was again Stephen Spender. So again the author felt a kind of pride and brotherhood with this poet, and finally he understood who he was and how great he was and how he had failed to recognize him or understand his importance when this poet had come to the studio. So thank you, and do like the video. I hope you have understood.